Welcome to the State of Mind podcast. My name's Chris. In this episode, I'm joined by Guy Sengstock from Berkeley, California. Guy is the owner and founder of the Circling Institute based in Berkeley and focuses on personal development, leadership training for individuals and groups through a philosophy-based approach to self-help and psychotherapy. Although we do discuss circling and his role in its foundation to some extent in this podcast, the bulk of the discussion actually centers around the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who was active in the early and mid-20th century and transformed Western philosophy completely. Heidegger is known for influencing modernism and postmodernism, but his own philosophy is starkly different from those intellectual movements. This discussion wasn't aimed to become too technical, and I deliberately tried to keep the conversation general enough for an introduction into his ideas and his ontology, so there's no requirement on the listener's part for familiarity with Heidegger's work per se. Guy was a fascinating speaker, and I got a lot out of our discussion, which could have gone on much longer and often became extremely challenging to conceptualize, but this is common when discussing any of Heidegger's ideas. I hope you enjoy this episode. If you have any comments or feedback, just send them via the Facebook page, State of Mind Podcast, or through Twitter at State of Mind CJ. This episode will also be available for download on iTunes. And now I give you Guy Sengstock. I'm here with Guy Sengstock. Hopefully I'm saying that right, Guy. Thanks for joining us. It's kind of exciting to be talking to someone from California when I'm in Australia, so that's great. And obviously we're going to be talking about Heidegger in this particular episode, not just him, associated issues and topics, but I just wanted to kind of start by getting a bit of background from you and where your interests are.
It's interesting. My journey with Heidegger has been so compelling to me, how I got into Heidegger and the impact. I'm continually finding the impact that he's had on me as a person in this way that I keep finding out about, which is just, I think, so telling of who he is as a thinker. The thing I'm most known for is being one of the main founders of something called Circling.
Yep.
Which is something that a group of friends of mine and I came across spontaneously in the way that we were relating to each other at Burning Man in 1998. Do
you want to quickly just explain what Burning Man is? I know of it instantly, but maybe just give a...
I'll do my best. The Burning Man, you could say, is it's interesting. It's probably the most living religious experience in probably that's maybe has ever happened, right? But is definitely is happening right now. And what's so interesting about Burning Man is it's not explicitly religious. It's, I don't know, at this point 100,000 people or something like that show up in the middle of the desert, right? Wow. Like the salt flats in Nevada, and build a city with a man, right? I don't know, 3 or 4 story man that they burn at the end of it. And the man doesn't symbolize anything, and no one's meeting for any reason. And it's filled with, I think it's originally started as a bunch of modern artists, postmodern artists, basically, and people basically come and they camp and they make these art cars and these wild camps and obstacle courses. And it's an amazing experience.
So sorry to interrupt, this circling concept come out of that, or was it taken to as an attitude towards that kind of event?
I think it's more like the context or the space that Burning Man opens up. It makes sense to me that the 6 or 7 of us that discovered Circling discovered it there, but it wasn't something that was put on by Burning Man or something like that. It was something that just happened because there's you could say that another thing about Burning Man is you could say that it's a place where profound conversations get started. And Twitter got started there. Apparently, if you're high up in Google, they require you to go to Burning Man every year. It's a space where mind just becomes something extraordinary. And at the end of it, the other person I was with, Jerry Candelaria, him and I became kind of, you could say, the two people that were ended up just naturally guiding the experience, or finding ourselves guiding the experience. And afterwards, we got done, and Jerry came up to me. He's like, and he went like this with his finger, that thing that just happened. I'm like, yeah, that thing, that was something, right? It was like, yeah, that was something extraordinary. I was like, yeah, that. And so we just shook hands on it in that moment, and we just committed to bring it out into the world. And we had no idea what that was or what that meant. But out of that handshake became something that then later became called circling, that started all kinds of communities in the Bay Area, that started a whole, emerged a whole vocabulary that is now emerging all over the world. It's in Europe, it's in Australia, it's in Russia, all kinds of places.
So I've got 2 points to make, but I want to quickly go to this one because this was the first thought. What's the applicability of this kind of system of thought in terms of relating to the other, which I think is what it boils down to, but in a very kind of ontological sense, not so much a psychological or character or personality clashes or something. It goes deeper than that. How do you apply that broadly, in the sense that you're talking about circling now becoming a worldwide phenomenon? How did that happen?
What it looks like is that people start communities, that they gather together and they do circling, right? So it's a way that people work in a group. It's also a lot of coaches and psychotherapists. And this is what's interesting, is like there's a lot of things that kind of look like that, but there's something very distinct about circling, in that most group work, you could say, are psychological in base, right? Which is you can say the kind of ontological understanding or premise underneath psychology is medical, right? Or it's about healing, which has a whole ontology. So when somebody puts the attention like in a classical like Gestalt group or something like that, the reason why everyone's attention is on them is for some kind of growth or change to happen. With circling, that's not the point. In fact, that's that's deviating away from the practice of circling. The whole point of circling is that we're all engaged in the practice of being with what is, right? Or what I like to say more poetically put, how profoundly can we be with what is? And to me, this is where we start to get into Heidegger, in the sense of that, to me, we start to engage in how you get at that, right? How do you get at is, right? As Heidegger would say, the event of truth, or the event of philosophy.
Yep.
Right. That happens, right? So it's like, so instead of asking this person questions in order to fix or change them, we're more asking questions in relating and listening and speaking and dialoguing to find out what is for that person, what is for the person who's leading the circle and participating, and what's being unconcealed between us, right? In what I think Martin Buber would say, the I-thou sense of the word, right? Like not relating, because if I'm trying to fix you, right, I'm relating to you as a means to an end of growth, right? Whereas an I-thou, that's more like an I-it relationship, where I-thou relationship is more that when I relate to you as a thou, you're not a means to an end. You're an end in yourself. It's interesting because it's like right when I start to relate to you as an end in yourself, as Buber would say, there's an I, because I-thou is spoken as one word. The I that arises in that relating to you as a thou becomes a very different I than the one that arises when, I'm doing laundry or. Yeah,
exactly. Right. I know exactly what you're saying in a Heideggerian sense, if that makes any sense at all. And I'll explain that. I think that I-thou dichotomy, like the subject-object dichotomy, is a step towards what you're saying, getting to that essence of is, being profoundly connected to it. It's a step closer to it than being a subject-object. So if you're seeing someone as, say, a friend in order to get a job, or just someone who you'll call on to have favors from, that's a classic subject-object worldview. And that's what most human beings operate like. But when you start, becoming a bit more primal, and looking at it as I'm just seeing the other person for them, for their own sake, like you said, you're getting a bit closer to something that you have in common.
Yes.
So that you're attuning yourself to opening up commonality. Right. And you're still thinking about yourself as, I'm Chris and you're Guy, but that's it. There's nothing outside of that relationship. It's not like you're Guy in order to do this podcast, that's stopped. That's the relationship that you're kind of attuning yourself, or I think Heidegger calls it comportment. So you comport yourself towards that kind of relationship on like a micro level, like just with the person you're relating to, and you get far more out of it than you would as treating them like a, object under a microscope, or using them as a tool, anything like that. They are all layers of meaning, and they're all valid aspects of humanity. But I think what you're going into, this circling, seems to be, because you keep saying, I'm still learning what it is. I think that's inevitable when you get down to these levels, or up. You can imagine it down or up. I'd imagine it as a ground to allow all of these other artificialities to occur.
Yes.
But that's a Heidegger view, but you can imagine it as an abstract, like up there, you're getting towards this kind of transcendent relationship with someone. And that's, I think, what best friends have.
Yeah.
Best friends are like, I'm not hanging out with my best friend just so I could get a date or, go get free beers. Although that's a nice, side effect. It's not how I relate to him or her. You know what I mean? So I don't know if that clarifies it a bit, but would you see circling as something kind of an approach that approximates that?
Oh yeah, totally. It's interesting because it's like, if bringing in Heidegger here, one of the things that Heidegger's, main thing, you could say that, most big philosophers have one thought, right? They have one thought that they think in various ways or disclose this thought their whole life. And for Heidegger's basic thought was, what is the meaning of being? And it's really difficult to start to get at that, right? Because if you think about it, we constantly comport the world as beings, right? I'm a being, the table's a being, the lamp's a being. And Heidegger says, like, well, in order to comprehend or even relate to or understand any being, I must already have an understanding of being with a capital B already. And he says like, that's, what do we mean when we say is, or we say it is, right? Like, what's the it? What's the is? And that background understanding, right? Or the meaning of the word is, or what that points to, is, you could say, the category of all categories that make categories possible. But here's the thing, is that, is Heidegger would say, the tricky part is that what philosophy had always tried to understand being by making it a being, which conceals being, right? And that's the tricky part, right? That's the tricky part, is you can't, in order to understand the background context of all contexts, if you turn it into a foreground phenomena, you conceal it, right?
And I think that was his problem with Immanuel Kant. I don't know if you ever got into Kant, because he's very dry, but he came up with that transcendental idealism, as in there's a category of all categories, like you said, the a priori, the before which, that allows us to have knowledge, that allows us to define what a plant is, or what a friend is, or what a stranger is. It's already there behind us. The problem with Kant's approach is it objectified knowledge of the world and of being as that is. So you're pointing to someone saying, that is my friend, instead of saying we are, or I, thou, or, a priori doesn't quite explain that in that sense. It's very scientific, and it's compelling in that idealist kind of Platonic sense of, well, we know what a friend is because we know what the concept of a friend is. We don't just know a friend, we know what friend, capital F, means.
Totally. And what even allows us to make that mistake, right, and not notice that we're making that mistake, is based on what we mean when we say being. And that historically, if you look back in history, is one of the things that Heidegger did after being in time, is he looked back at history in terms of what was the pre-thematic, right, the already always understanding of being at different epochs in history, right? And you could say that like the Industrial Revolution was, and this is what Kant and Descartes and, you know, all these different people kind of set up, which was subject object, being like disclosed itself as subject objects, and where the subject is trying to overcome the dominance of the object or overcome nature and all those kinds of things. You could say that like that presupposes an understanding of being, right? That's different than say like the Greeks, the early Greeks, which was more like, you can see it in their art, is like being was more like a poiesis or a flow or a bringing forth, right? More like a river or something like that.
Exactly. Well, Descartes a good, you brought up Descartes, where his famous cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, is the classic kind of like, I think, modern philosophical concept of what it means to exist.
Yeah.
Built on, like you said, those classical and pre-classical concepts of being. So you never had Greeks saying, I think therefore I am. Like really, they said, I know I'm not nothing. I know I'm not nothing. It's a double negative. So therefore, you know, and then Greeks love double negatives, and they loved all this wordplay, and Heidegger did too. So it's like, that's how they thought, because they couldn't quite say I am, because, but they said, I know I'm not nothing. So, and then they were thinking much more that was the, Heidegger was like, no, they were onto something. It's just,
right there, as you're like, you know, notice like, as you're going, okay, what, they know they're not nothing. So notice how you had to enter into that thought, and you're grappling with it, right?
Yeah.
To me, that's what we're talking about. That's what we're getting at, is that it's important for us as human beings, because we're the being that is concerned about our being and can be concerned about being as a whole. Right? We take our being as Heidegger would say, our being is an issue for us, right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
That there's a certain kind of, like, I would say I've really come to realize, and this is kind of what brings back a little bit to circling too, is that there's a kind of ethic, right, to that, to me. That in that we, in a certain sense, are we are a clearing for a world to occur, and that we aren't a thing. This is what's tricky about being human, right? Is like we disclose a world of things, yet we're not one of the things that's disclosed like other things. We have a different kind of being, right, that makes possible something like a thing to be disclosed or uncovered, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. So like a Sam Harris or a Richard Dawkins would be saying, no, we're animals, literally descendants of apes with a highly developed brain and neurophysiology. It's like, yes, but we're also 100 other things, one of which is, like you say, this opening up of a much more transcendental kind of existence that, say, apes don't have or can't have.
Yeah.
Or, you know, animals generally can't have, but human beings are different because they allow for, say, the concepts of calculus and mathematics to open up on top of what we normally do as a biological species. And this leads to conceptions of black holes and, you know, creations of atomic bombs. And, you know, it's just, you can't just limit it to this factical being in the world, as Heidegger would term it. It starts getting much more complicated the deeper you kind of go down and say, well, what is human being, capital B? We know what human beings, small b, are. We know what each one of us are. We can look up in a medical textbook what we are. That's fine. But we don't know what the collective being is. And there has to be a collective being if we are all of the same, you know, species. We have the same biology. We have the same infrastructure in our heads. So the thoughts we come up with, the ideas we put out into the world, the languages we use, you know, everything like that has a sum total. And breaking through how we view the world scientifically and factically, so to speak, so just like the there is kind of mentality was just highlighted when I try to say we aren't nothing, which still confuses me when I say it, because conceptualizing that in my head actually forces me to suspend language.
Yeah.
Which is
like that suspension. I think that's really important, right? Like where the movement of thinking starts to look at, catches a glimpse of its own movement, and it realizes that it can't get underneath or behind itself. But in that realization, realizing something's thinking, right? Some kind of movement's happening. All of a sudden it stops, right? And there's this clearing or this opening. And I would say that kind of unconcealment of that opening, right, is the kinds of things that happen in something like circling, right? Where it's like I'm relating to Tom not as a thing amongst other things, but we start to disclose Tom as what starts to get unconcealed is the being of Tom's being, right? And we can't make that a being, but there's this disclosure that happens that there's this the unconcealedness, right, gets revealed, and there's this quality of deep respect and deep beauty and deep profoundness that can be just utterly change someone's life forever. I've watched people get circled and they walked in one way and they walked out another way in a way that they can't describe, but the world occurs to them differently. And of course, all of our actions, as I think Gregory Bateson really points out, that all behavior is a function of perception. So if how you perceive radically changes, how you act will change as well. And I've seen that happen over and over and over and over again through this, like just sitting with somebody or a group of people sitting with somebody and just being with what is, right? And if you follow is all the way down, you end up in these places of some of the deepest mysteries in the whole universe.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And like the best example I could think of psychology and behavior being a function of perception is just look at religious zealots, people who go and join ISIS or something like that. It's like, we can't comprehend doing that, but we obviously don't have their perception about the world, but their perception informs the fact that they can take a plane ride over to Syria or wherever and become these horrible, mercenaries and that. Whilst people like us can't understand the steps, we can understand the rudimentary kind of radicalization framework, but getting into someone's head and saying, what comes first, chicken or the egg? Is it just they're acting like that and they convince themselves that it's right, or is it really coming from somewhere deeper?
Totally. And I like what you said, like getting in someone's head, that movement you did, getting in someone's head. There's that quality of like, that's a different way of attempting to understand, to stand over, right?
Yeah.
Or to overstand versus understand, right? There's a humility there, and there's this quality of them entering into something, and there's this way or this background sense of like, okay, in entering into it, in order to really know, to get in your head, I must in some way be changed by that, right? In the process of understanding, the way I understand, i.e. what I call myself, can possibly be really altered. I will be different in some way once I go through that ride.
I'm just thinking applicability wise, how important would something like circling be to, say, government policy when you're dealing with people, things like radicalization or, race hate groups and people whose views are just so outside the mainstream, where government goes, we understand the resentments and the problems, but we have to tackle it with force and crack down using the law and all that. It's like, you're not really using understand in its correct meaning there. You're, like you said, you're overstanding, you're objectifying, studying the problem, categorizing it, and then making a policy about it. But you're not really understanding it. Like government isn't understanding it, or whatever organization isn't understanding it. Police aren't understanding it. There's a applicability here that I think would be vital to solving some of these cultural and racial tensions that happen, especially in America, but like anywhere in the world. If you had approaches like this to policy, I think just from my own kind of perspective, that would be really interesting. And I would wonder where that could lead, like you get a bit more of a deeper understanding of the psychology and the behavior of people by going to this kind of comportment of not there is, but I, thou. Let me just understand what's in your head, where you're coming from, what your perceptions are, and how they're similar to, like, where's our commonality? Because there has to be commonality. We're humans, you know what I mean? Yeah. So all this stuff, I think, is just, Heidegger sounds very theoretical, but when you actually start looking at things like this, there's huge scope.
Totally. It's interesting. yeah, it's more like, I think Heidegger, I would say, has a method, right? You know, he invites people not to like, he invites people, you could say, to go on the way of thought. Now, if I know where I'm going, if I know where I'm going to end up ahead of time, which is what most people call thinking or debate it, right? He would say that that's not real thinking, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, as you said, the what did you say, the being there, right?
Being in the
sense,
world or something.
totally, like that. On some level, I've already got something wrapped up, and when I look at whatever phenomena I'm looking at, all I'm doing is to gather evidence for what I already know.
Right.
And as Heidegger would say, that perhaps it would be a good idea that we begin to hear something other than we already think.
Yeah, it's like I am saying I'm going exploring, right? And I follow a map to the end of the jogging route or the hiking route. It's like, you're not exploring. I mean, you're walking through a route and you're seeing things on the way that are interesting and so on. And you're objectifying them and stuff and studying them in your own way. But you're not really exploring. Exploring would be throwing away a map and walking down a path and seeing where it goes. Obviously not well advised, but I mean, that's what Jordan Peterson was saying. The people who were remembered, the people who gather the most knowledge in the past were the ones who stepped out into the chaos and actually challenged themselves mentally and physically. And, you know, relating that to Heidegger is really important, I think, because that's what he's trying to do. That's why he struggles to get the language to work. Like, he puts so much strain on language, I've noticed. Like, it strains German, which is what he spoke. But then when it's translated in English, it gets even like near breaking point, to the point we have to invent new words just to get at the exact kind of idea. And it is important to be precise when talking about these things, because otherwise it gets very blurry and kind of all over the place. You don't know what you're talking about. But going back to that point, exploring versus just walking along a path that's already been tread, that is really the problem with like thinking nowadays. Like in the modern era, when you listen to people argue or have a debate, you know, to get the idea out of it, it's like, not really. They're not really thinking. They're not really debating. They're just kind of going down familiar routes and that they've tread 1,000 times before and repeating it. And I don't think that's conducive to progress, to new knowledge, to new understanding of, you know, human being, capital B. It's like, that is not the way to it. That's like the path in the opposite direction that we've been going since Greece fell, and you know, we've completely compartmentalized knowledge. And I always kind of, I don't know what podcast was it, but it might have been Jordan Peterson and Stephen Molyneux, I can't remember, but they were talking about how universities, it might have been Sam Harris, but they were talking about how universities basically compartmentalize knowledge. So if you go to a college campus, you'll see signs that go biology department, history department, you know, humanities and all that. And it's like, well, there is some logic to that just for resourcing and, you know, administrative reasons, but the human mind doesn't work that way. Thinking doesn't work that way. The world doesn't work that way. So why are we teaching people that way? And I always find that interesting. It's not to say everyone has to be a polymath or someone who's an expert in everything, but it's like you said, this intersubjectivity, this interconnectedness of thought and being. If you don't understand that, you're really just you're gonna be lost. You know.
And if you think about it, that the interconnectedness. Okay, if we ask ourselves, okay, how do we begin to hear the interconnectedness of things, and how do we not hear it? How do we not see it? And I think it comes part of the issue.
That second half is the hardest. How do we not see it? Because by definition, we don't know what we don't know, right?
Here's the thing that I really enjoy about Peterson. Now, Peterson actually later, he didn't really know about Heidegger until well after his work, and then realized that they were kind of starting to get at the same thing. I think that's really interesting. And I think it comes down to what Peter's kind of understanding or respect about the grappling, what it is to grapple with thought, which is on some levels what brings us to something like reality. And he says, like, one of the things that the way he puts it, he's like, okay, so, you know, there's all the things that we know. There's the category of what we know, and then there's the category of that we don't, like we know that we don't know. And then then we all know that there's a whole category of everything that we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know, but we know that. How do we represent that which we don't know that we don't know? Right? The fact that I can say it, right, like, means that I must be able to comprehend it in some way, but how the hell do I represent something that I don't know? And I don't know that I don't know it, but I know it. Right? That, to me, that's a really great way of disclosing or starting to feel back into, right, something like what Heidegger was pointing to when he said the being of beings, right? And I think that, like, what you could say is that I think one of the things that you pointed to is that people really don't think much anymore. It's more like they point their faces at each other and then shoot cannons, right? And if my thought is bigger than your thought, right? And you get into these, like, especially the internet is just filled with this, like, it festers with that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, it's almost like bringing in my kind of ancient history interests. It's like we have worldwide sophistry. We've enabled sophists, the types who were paid to just make arguments in ancient Greece. They were like philosophers like Plato and Socrates hated them because they were paid professional trolls, essentially. Like, they would go out and just be devil's advocate and say, well, no, actually, I think the world is made out of water and that's the fundamental element and here's why. And they'd actually be smart people, like lawyers, essentially, and they'd just be able to create fancy arguments.
Right.
And never ever change their mind. They'd just be like paid to say the same thing, like propaganda pieces. And I think now we have that on a global scale. Like, we have people, whether it's right wing, left wing, or whether it's, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, or something like that. There is no coming together to kind of, in the conflict, come to a deeper truth about, say, what is politics or what does it mean to be a good leader. It's actually, no one cares about that. And I'm not saying we're post-fact. I'm not talking about that. I'm actually talking about we're post-thinking. Like, there's no time to think anymore in this Heidegger sense, in this ancient Greek sense, in this philosophical sense. It's more, how can I think in this route? Like, I need a map to tell me how to get from A to B, whether it's in a debate or an online conversation or on a TV show. And all I have to do is tread the route, get the main points out, and then get to B, and that's it. And it's like, why don't you just sit there and go with the flow and see what happens?
It's interesting. It's like, I really like that. And I would say that there is this I think some of this is really based on a misconception of of something that one of the ways that we don't see the interconnectedness of things, or as you would say, the flow that would go if we saw it, right, is actually not seeing, but what is the silence in which all discourse and speaking presupposes, which is listening, right? Because if you look at it, like, ontologically speaking, right, a speaking is always a speaking and presupposes a listening that calls forth speech, right? If there was no listening, there would be no speech to be called forth, and that ontologically is prior and presupposed to language. Now, but we usually think about, when we think about, like, dialogue, we think about talking, right? Pointing our faces at each other and making noise, right? But we don't think about, like, what's calling forth the conversation. And what's calling forth the conversation is something already a relation is there. And you can start to tap into the relation through a kind of listening. And listening in a very different sense. Like, I think that, like, the common sense understanding of listening is to be a good listener is something like this. It's like, I have an empty head, right? And I kind of, like, I pull my head up, and as you talk, you fill it with words. And if I shut up long enough, right, and the words fill up, and I close it, and you're like, okay, you get me.
Yeah, basically.
But that's not listening. Listening is synonymous with interpretation, right? And as Heidegger would say, that the human being is the being that's interpretation all the way down. In other words, we're meaning all the way down, right? And so listening, right, isn't just being quiet, right, hearing what you say. No, listening is where I'm opening up, right, the very structures of the way I make sense, right? It's
Mm.
another way of saying, as Heidegger would say, I open up my authentic care, my concernfulness, or the way I make sense of making sense. And in understanding you, in listening to you, that the way I make sense, and even like in profound listening, the deep structures in which that make anything at all comprehensible to me, in understanding you, I begin to change those things. And in that change that I then maybe speak or I maybe do in silence, when I disclose that change to you, and it's happening probably right now on some level, right? As I disclose that change to you, is the process of you feeling understood or you feeling heard, right?
Yeah.
Not being quiet, right? Or being convinced. It's being willing to be altered or changed by a dialogue, right?
Yeah. Putting yourself in a comportment that is extremely open to change.
Yeah.
On like an internal level. And I love Peterson's example. I think he took it from Piaget or someone he keeps mentioning, but like psychology in the sense of you have a conversation, and when you listen and you're listening properly, the only way you can listen properly is if you care about what's being said. If you're listening for listening's sake, and a small L listening, like, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but it's like, no, everyone who says that, you've never really listened. You were just waiting to say a point. That you can tell that in conversations, even if you observe, people on TV. It's like, that guy didn't even listen to a word he said. But if you actually care, you will shut up, you will be quiet, and things will die and be reborn inside your own soul, like in a ontological or spiritual sense, whatever you want to call it. You will literally have ideas that'll just be resurrected and say, oh, I never thought of it like that way, or I did know about it, but not in that sense, or I thought of it this way. He's made his point. I'm convinced that's the wrong way, and that's dead. So it's like there's existence, non-existence happening internally all the time. And that for me is like, if you're actually listening, that will be like that'll be like an actual feeling that you experience inside you.
And I'm wondering, are you having that feeling right now?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I'm not in the sense of I'm not being challenged to think a different way so much as I'm getting more ideas that I've never actually articulated.
Yeah.
Probably because I've wanted to, but no one cares about Heidegger. That's probably the main issue.
So what I mean, you could say that on one level, we could say that like, you could say you're speaking right now, right, is being disclosed in our mutual care, but specifically in this dialectic, in this moment, right, it is being disclosed or being in the, my listening is a space of unconcealment of new thought coming into being.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And you have to be willing and open to that change, to that.
Yes.
You want new ideas to actually come into the clearing so you can see them. And it's like, there they are. I recognize it, but I haven't seen it in that light. That seems to be what's happening now. Or I'm saying something for the first time that I've been thinking for years. And it's starting to make sense or not make sense, in my head. And like this, when I said that thing about the not being nothing, I've always thought it and written it, but I've never articulated it. And it hits you in a very different way. And it's like, okay, now I'm starting thinking a bit.
Yes, that right there. It's like that right there.
Yeah.
I never quite articulated it right there. Yeah. And I think one of the things, where our original, like where we met was through our interest in Peterson. And I think what Peterson does, right, and he explicitly talks about this, is he says what he tries to model for his students is it's not like in his classes, if you watch him, I think this is why people, I don't think people understand why they find him so compelling. I think they think that they find him so compelling because of the content that's delivered. But I actually think what makes him so compelling is that what he's doing, right, is that he's not presenting information, right? He's not informing people. He's getting up and he's engaging in a dialogue and he's working out his thinking in a living way, right? And so when you listen, he's actually dialoguing with you. And it's what's in it is the interesting thing I really like about, and what's so infectious about listening to him for me, is that I feel like I'm always being addressed. I always feels like there's a sense in which he's addressing me directly, and in order to understand what he's saying, right, I actually have to get over right at the edge of the there I am right now. Like if I just bring myself like that, I'm just right. It's right on the tip of my tongue, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're starting to enter into the unknown, right? In a certain sense, it's kind of chaotic, but we're allowing thought to move towards what it doesn't know, and it doesn't know that it doesn't know.
Yeah, exactly.
And it didn't know that I've been trying to think about this the whole time, but like as I'm talking about it, like I'm becoming to like realize like, oh, I've been thinking about this, and I'm just bringing it into language.
Yeah, and it's like hesitating.
Yes.
You're not confident in it. It could evaporate at any minute because it's on the tip of your tongue, but you've got this whole structure of thought that you want to kind of get out there. And it's like, well, crap, language isn't keeping up with the brain. It's like, yeah, obviously, because one is more originary than the other, not so much the brain, the mind, which,
Yes.
That dichotomy, it's like we have speech in the brain and, one is a product of the other, but the mind, in fact, grounds what you're speaking,
Totally.
why you care about bringing speech into the world in the first place.
Totally. So I think I want to put a bookmarker on care, right? Because that's a real big thing with Heidegger. What do we mean? What is care, right? And if you think about this thing about like, yeah, I don't quite have it's frustrating, or it can be daunting or insecure because I don't yet have thought is ahead of language at that point, right? And you could say that and this is what's interesting about Heidegger is that he had to practically invent a whole new language, right? To hyphenize things. And I think what that is, what that shows is not that he was trying to be super smart or something, is that he followed the movement of thought, that thought goes ahead of language. And then the thought itself becomes like a listening, right, that draws forth a new kind of speech. And you could say that language trail, right, is that language trail that it leaves behind is a new vocabulary that comes into being, right?
Yeah. And it's also because the tools we're given to speak have been given to us through past experience, which is defined factically, school, university, family, their education, everything like that has a past, and the tools we're given to express this just very primal kind of understanding of human being, what it is to live with other human beings and share things in common and think things in common or get to truths that we otherwise wouldn't have thought of. We suddenly find all those tools are very much limited, or at least hamstrung by circumstance and our upbringing. So I've bookmarked the care thing because that's another thing I can't get my head around, but because I think I'm approaching it from this kind of perspective of
and to me that you can't get your head around it tells me that you're actually starting to approach it, right?
Is that why you chose? Because I know Heidegger uses like hermeneutics or it kind of is like an approach to interpretation that was used by, say, church fathers and rabbis for the Talmud. And it's like we don't exactly want to say what it is, because saying that would make it false, or it would run away from us if we actually pointed the light at it. We actually just want to go around it, look at it from different angles, and then we'll get a better picture before going straight in. You know what I mean? Is that the circling kind of concept? That's how, as soon as you said it in Heidegger, that's how I thought.
Yeah, I would say that I would say that, and it's interesting. It's like after circling, after the fact, I realized that what we were doing was something like hermeneutic phenomenology, right? But it was from wandering around and us getting together and looking and then standing back and looking at it, that then I started to get into Heidegger, and all of a sudden I started to bring, that's what we're doing. And then I realized that in understanding what we didn't know that we understood, moving back on itself, creating a whole, like a new whole, if you will, of understanding, that is hermetic phenomenology.
Okay, so I guess like what I forgot to ask earlier was, in terms of your contact with Heidegger, did you come across him, I don't want to say the word organically, but kind of like maybe accidentally or incidental to something you were interested in? Or was it like a formal kind of, I want to read one of his books and see what he's saying kind of thing?
I definitely want to answer your question, but it just hit me that as you were saying that when you forgot to ask me about that, I think that's so cool, right? In that it tells me that what we're following, right, is not some pre-scripted thing. Like the topic that we're talking about, we're actually doing, we're enacting the topic, right?
Yeah,
We're living.
We're circling
right?
back here a bit.
Yeah, our way of being, right? We're being the topic in a certain sense. So that because we weren't following a script, we were following a movement, right? As Heidegger maybe would say, following the movement of the showing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but to answer your question, I didn't. So I'm a graduate of the San Francisco Art Institute, and where I went to college, and it was it's this avant-garde, like really obscure, one of the most avant-garde art schools in the world.
Yeah.
And so, like, I just remember that we had like art school math was just this guy coming in and talking about theoretical physics. We didn't even look at a number. So it was so not academic in the traditional sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But somewhere along the way, I can't exactly tell you how or why. Oh yeah, I remember it. Yeah, my friend, one of the early, back in the day when we first started circling, David Niebauer, he had taken. Oh, that's right. He had taken the Landmark Forum, and apparently the Landmark Forum, through the influence of Fernando Flores was a Heideggerian. And so a lot of the language in the Landmark Forum, which is like, you could say is like a ontological education or kind of a personal growth program that comes originally from Werner Erhard and Est, back in the late 60s, early 70s.
It's kind of like some companies used it, didn't they, for team building and stuff like that? Is that right? Yeah.
Totally. It's been a massive influence on the culture in a way that it doesn't really get credited for.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of controversy about it. We can go to that if you want, but he had just taken it, and he had gotten, out of his curiosity, he had just gotten the basic works of Heidegger. And I saw it on his table. I'm like, what's that? And like, we started talking about it a little bit. I'm like, this is interesting. And now just to kind of understand where I'm coming from here is I'm not like smart in any traditional sense of the word, right? I had reading disabilities. I couldn't learn how to read until I was like 11 or 12. I dyslexia. And I came from a really, really like kind of troubled background, with my parents and stuff like that. So I had like a lot of like trauma and all kinds of stuff, right? And so when I was Mrs. Brutch's, I got shipped from school to school to school, my educational background, because no one could teach me how to read.
Yeah.
And then I got this amazing special ed teacher that would take me out of like a mainstream class for a couple of hours. And I think, looking back on it, I think what she did is she somehow tricked me into using my right brain to read. Right. Yeah. I'm not sure if that's actually accurate, but there's something about it that she somehow kind of like got how I cognized and had me approach reading from that way. And what's interesting about it is like, I started to learn how to read. And I didn't notice it.
Right.
Right. Like I didn't notice it until I just remember one day, it was a Friday or something. And then you get this big stack of graded papers. Right. And I brought it home like every Friday and I put it on the table. And my mom, I remember going like, oh my God. Right. Like I had gotten something above a D on a number of papers. And I just remember that I was like, oh, wow. And I think that I think that was telling of when I looked at Heidegger, what may have been one of the things that made me permeable to it. And so basically I started looking at Heidegger and reading Heidegger, and I had no idea what he was trying to talk about.
Join the queue.
But I have to say though that it was like, I didn't understand, okay, what he was saying, but it was the kind of not understanding that actually drew me deeper into it for some reason, right?
Well, could I just pause here for a sec, just to make an observation? I reckon you would have been in a better position to absorb and understand Heidegger than, say, a philosophy professor would be. And the reason I say that is because a philosophy professor already has 1,000 preconceptions of, say, what being means and how you come to it, that it's just clouding his view of how to read Heidegger. And
Right.
Heidegger was really a paradigm shift in the history of Western philosophy. No one really disputes that, even if they hate him.
Right.
So someone like you coming to that fresh, I think, is actually at an advantage, ironically.
I think so.
That's my theory.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And this is where it starts to get into the interesting thing about concealment and unconcealment, because that was concealed to me, right? Like the categories, and because I know if I was in school and they gave me Heidegger, like I would have read the same thing and I would have not read it. I would have put it off and like on my tests or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
But he was alive for me, and it was interesting because right at that time was right at the beginnings of circling too. At the same time, now I didn't draw the connection between the two until 2 or 3 years later. That's what's also compelling to me too. Yeah, and then I would just start to read it, and I remember because I lived in North Beach, and in North Beach we had a Barnes and Nobles like a block away, and I was a poor student, right? So I get off school or off work, and I'd go to Barnes and Noble, and of course no one would ever buy the Heidegger book, so it was like my own personal little like Heidegger. And I would just take it off the shelf and I'd just read it. I'd read it. And what was interesting is it wasn't until about 3 years later that all of a sudden I saw one that I hadn't seen, right? But I understood in some way, but not in the over against way, but in the bottom up sense of the word, that circling, reading Heidegger and then circling, reading Heidegger and then circling, that motion, Heidegger transformed my mind. And because it transformed my mind, it transformed what I saw and how I listened. And so when I would look at a person, I noticed that where my attention would go was not necessarily just on what the person was saying, but what was so near to them, what had to already be true in them in order to say what they were saying, right? That motion is, I like that. All of a sudden I realized that, and I was like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, that's what Heidegger's doing, right? Like,
because it's beyond analyzing motives, say, and saying, well, what's his agenda when he's saying that? It's actually like, no, forget the layer of argument and where that's coming from.
Yeah.
Like the feelings, the body language, how he's comporting himself or herself to be.
The world. And I think the important word here is the horizons, right? The horizons that like are necessarily concealed from the person's view, that gives them the ground that they then stand on to not just say the things that they're saying, but saying them in the way that they're saying, including presupposing the listening that they're speaking into. That all of that started to be unconcealed to me, and I could say, talk about that. Like when you were like for example, when people would start to talk, I started to notice like that they would be explaining themselves as if they, for example, like as if somebody was interrogating them, but nobody would be interrogating them, and I'd be like, and I would notice that, right? And I'd be like, who are you talking to? And they would do this thing where it'd be like this look, right? This look, and I've seen that look a couple of times since we've been talking, like, right, whoa, that moment of suspension, where background becomes foreground. Who was I talking to? Right? And that would then lead to a completely different relational event, right? Of like, oh wow, like who was I talking to? And it would be something like, oh my God, my dad just interrogated me my whole life. And so on some level, I have been comporting the world as something like my dad, and then trying to work that thing out and trying to finally, which of course gives him a particular quality of I. Then when we'd say like, who was I talking to? In that moment, that stepping back, the horizon, you now have a new horizon. So what was horizon, right, becomes foreground, and then we have a dialogue about that. But then that starts to, then I would start to notice things like, what is that what you're speaking from now?
Yeah.
And that mirrors something that Keegan who's based in Piaget, right, would say that how psychological or moral development happens, which is I see with the level of development, right? I see with it. I don't see it, right? So the meaning that I'm talking about is given by the psychological development that I'm in, and then developing to the next frame is where I pop out to a higher level of organization, and then I see the level. Subject goes object. And then the process of evolving to the next level is this, where then I look at this new level of meaning that I used to see with, and then I begin to comport it or translate it into this higher level of complexity. And at a certain culminating point, I pop out. And that's psychological development, right? That abstracting out and then applying those abstractions back to the level that I've abstracted out, which creates more complexity.
And the thing is, in that process, you'd see all those horizons. You'd still see them. But they don't get evaporated once they become objectified. You actually now have them at your disposal to make meaning and therefore develop, which is back to Peterson kind of citing Dostoevsky, sort yourself out, work out what's in your soul and the conflict in your soul and the things you're not seeing that are motivating, influencing, affecting, holding you back. And then once you go, I like your analogy about you're in front of the horizon or whatever, and then it suddenly becomes you're above it or whatever, and you can see it for the first time as something that's part of your being, that, say, whether it's a parent influencing how you speak, it seems like kind of immaterial, or it seems a bit minuscule in terms of someone's whole life, but it's like, no, that's there with you forever until you notice it, until you can objectify and say, okay, right, well, so what am I going to do about it, and how do I change my comportment or my attunement to the rest of the world based on what I know now, which is, I think, kind of critical to self-development. And it's like something so rare nowadays because people don't think in that mode of being, like, what is part of my being? How can I sort them out and order them so I'm not kind of like just in this muck of, your tunnel vision is the best way to put it. Yeah.
Totally. And it's interesting because this gets at, and I'll go back to like kind of my early grappling with Heidegger. So interesting. I'm feeling like I feel lit up, right? Like this, I feel kind of goosebumps or something. And I think part of why I feel the goosebumps is because all of a sudden I saw the way that you were impacted by what I said. You went like this, and it was almost like I felt like a new meaning was emerging in your listening, right? You started to get something, and in this certain way, I started to listen, right, to you're starting to grapple with what I said. And in some way I was registering some kind of change happening in you, and it registered over here as goosebumps. Right?
Well, your kind of Heideggerian explanation of psychological and personality developmental, studies that Piaget, Peterson, and Keegan and all that you were citing, I understood that in the sense of there is that theory. And then the analogy you brought up with Heidegger was actually, I now visually see the truth of it. Like, there's just, in my mind, when I saw what you were doing, I was like, there's no real disputing in my mind that is truth to some extent. Doesn't matter how you explain it. You could have explained it a different way, but it is still true.
And it
sense.
That's
what it was. It wasn't like that is. It's like it just it was concealed before. It unconcealed itself through talking and visual imagery. And for me, I don't know whether I'll use it or not, but it's definitely a tool that would help me anyway, personally, down the road if I ever have a problem like that. It's like, why am I doing this particular thing in my life? And you can kind of step back and view it as like a series of horizons that don't necessarily dissolve once you hit on them, but they're actually there for you to manipulate and kind of work out, sort out, whatever you want to call it. And that for me is like that's why the two kind of meld at that point where you just said it. I thought, okay, it was like that all the time. I just didn't really have that perspective. So
Is it kind of like you knew about that Piaget, and you knew about that, you use the word that, right? But then in understanding or in listening, is it fair to say that became this? You knew about this.
Yes, it was much closer. Yeah.
I don't know why. I've just been compelled by that experience of when I say that is, right, versus this is. It's a very different experience, right? And I think what I say when I say that is a lamp, versus when I say this is a lamp. The is in the that is kind of already worked out. It's over there. But when I say this, that points to an is that's already worked out and advanced, right? When I say this, I think what I'm pointing to is the relationship between the two.
And I think this has more of a care element as opposed to that. Yeah, that's what I would say about it. Because if someone says a command to you like, dear Guy, I'd like you to talk to so-and-so. If you could do that for me as soon as possible, it'd be great, right? Very formal, do that for me. If you're talking to someone, usually what you say is, it'd be really great if you could do this for me because it means a lot, or, you know, it's just so much closer, whether it's, you know, in terms of relations with someone else, then that is it has a specific way you place yourself to an object or a person. You know what I mean? Like when you say, I want you to do that, it's somehow further away, you know, from what you actually care about, if that makes sense. But if you could do this for me, you like naturally the rhythm of language, you expect to hear, I would really appreciate it, or that would be really great, or that would be really important. Like it means more. I don't know if that's kind of like
I can use the word care again.
Yeah.
Care about it, right? So there's this quality of like that, and I think that starts to point to, and I want to start to see if we can kind of start to uncover that a bit of when you use the word care, and this is the existential question, right? We're not going to say what is care, but when you say care, what do you mean, right? And then that's a very different question, right? So if I say what is care versus what do you mean when you say care, then we start to move into the background, right? Right. We start to unconceal what was concealed, or as I think Peterson points out so well, like all the way through biology, all the way up into consciousness, in that he would say that when in the mythological enactment of the stories in a ritual, it was like an embodied cognition, right? It was embodied. They lived the knowledge, right? They didn't know about it. They had not abstracted out something like mythology. They lived in myth, and they couldn't explain to you the rules of the games that they were doing. It was a higher level of development when they were able to abstract it out and go that, right? That abstracting out, right, and then applying that abstraction back to it, right, starts to create new categories of understanding. And that's very much was my experience of realizing that so much of how I learned what circling and continue to learn what circling is, was how much it had to do with Heidegger.
Yeah.
So what I realized years later is when I look back, I was like, oh my God, like some of the terminology that we use, like bidding someone's world, right? The word aletheia, we would use that word a lot. Unconcealment, right? Unveiling, horizon, all those kinds of things. I was like, wait a minute. Like, this is like, I was like, oh my God. It was this reading Heidegger and then relating to something in the world, reading Heidegger and relating to the world, it transformed my mind. And I think and this is the point of Heidegger, he's not trying to get you he's not trying to inform you of anything, right? He's basically saying, walk along the path of thinking and let's see if we can discover that which is worthy of thought, which is two things. It's like that which is worthy of thought is that we have yet begun thinking.
Yeah.
And that which is worthy of thought is that thinking is in fact happening, right? What is thinking, right? As we're thinking, right?
Yeah.
That we're discovering. It's a disclosure. It's like going into the chaos, or like getting into the, like, I didn't know that I didn't know, and grappling with it. And this is what Peterson talks about. Like, we have one foot in chaos, we have one foot in order, and we find that like sweet spot. And in those moments is living meaning. And those are the moments in those kinds of flow states, right, where it's not a doubt at all whether or not all the pain and suffering that is life was worth it. Like, it's not even a question, right, in those moments.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, when it's a cliche, but when you say time flies when you're having fun, think about that in the sense of standing in that chaos and meaning interface and just like being in the moment. Time doesn't exist.
Right.
You know,
but temporality, begins to be lived, right?
Yeah, and that's another kind of
time, if you will.
The time aspect of this is something we haven't gone into, because Heidegger's famous work is Being and Time. We've been talking about being for most of this, but time is something that is very much, just like language, a limiting factor to understanding these truths, I think, anyway. And like, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on it, but just going back to this care kind of thing, it strikes me as also from Being in Time, when Heidegger talks, like, there's similarities between when Heidegger talks about most human beings, the they, as in the mass of people that we consider human beings in society and all these abstract nouns, those people in their everyday lives turn away from questions like, what does it mean to have being? What does it mean to live in the world? What is existence? How does this change or modify my behavior in my life to make the most out of, you know, being and be in touch with other people in a more primordial way? All these kind of outcomes, we turn away from them because we'd rather go and, I don't know, do a job and get money or watch TV, or, you know, we prefer to stay in the order area of that yin and yang, then cross that interface and go into stuff we don't know or worried about knowing, you know, things that we are scared might actually change how we act or how we live if we find out about them. And I think that's so true, that Heidegger, that's not even like, when I read that, I thought that's more kind of like what I'd expect to hear a novelist write. Yeah. Someone who's writing a formal philosophical book about, you know, concepts like being and existence. I thought that he just hit the nail on the head there. And we always know it because we act like that. Like, I act like that. I'd rather just get stuck in the office and do my work and head down and, you know, do that. If there's a problem on the horizon about my future or questioning how I've been acting, ethics, morals, all that, it's easier to turn my back to it. And then just get on with it. Yeah,
at the same time, is the turning back, right? You could say that thing about just get this thing done. You know, Heidegger would say that's the mode of inauthenticity, right?
Yeah, however, that's right. Yeah,
that deeper horizon, right? You will say the ethical conversation, right? Rather than dealing with that, I'm like doing this. It's still given by that. It's still given by my existence. It's still given by that on some level, I am care, right? And that's what's interesting about, like, when you get into these deeper questions, it's like, if, for example, if we ask ourselves, like, you know, what do I mean when I say care? Or even if I ask the question, what is care? It's interesting. What I'm doing in asking that question is I'm caring, right? It presupposes that I'm in care. I live in care. I'm not a subject. It's not a subjective. I'm not a being that then cares about stuff. I am a being that cares, right?
And care is like this pool that you're either in or you're not in. Like, it's, if you're in care, you're in care. It's not like so much a spectrum where I kind of care, but you know, it's like it's something or the other. You can't be.
What I think what Heidegger would say is that like care isn't an attribute that you express.
It's a
that
mode of being or something.
The being of your being is a care.
Right.
So
yeah.
Like here's a good way of kind of getting at it. You could say that the earth births nature.
Mm-hmm.
Nature births people. People birth worlds.
Yeah.
Like the earth births nature. Nature births people. People birth worlds.
Yeah.
Right. And if we say, well, what is it to world? Right. You know, I think Dawkins and those kinds of people, when they say that, yeah, I'm an ape that thinks, right? They would say that we have an environment. No, we don't live in an environment, right? No. We have a world, right? You could say, as Corey Anton would say, that we decompress Earth into world, right? That there's something about the way that we care, that caring notices some things and doesn't notice other things. And in the horizon or the limitation of my caring, like when I bring the limits of that horizon, it creates a ground that's a world of concern, right? And my whole life is, I can't make a single motion that isn't given by care.
Yeah, and exactly.
That's why he says that, like, our world, like, you know, as I like to say, is like encircling, we call it about like getting your world. Well, what does that mean, really? When I get your world, it's like all of a sudden, in order to get your world, I have to start to care about what you care about, to then articulate what it is that you're already standing inside of, that then has your attention notice what it notices and not notice what it doesn't notice.
Yeah, exactly.
I can start to get into these deeper levels of the being of your being, right? Which is synonymous with care. And
just to add to that, I think that kind of, again, the very lucid image you just put out of earth, nature, people, world, that for me is like when Peterson talks about hell, right? And I remember in the Joe Rogan podcast, he talks about, Joe Rogan brings up, the apocalypse is already around us. You know, you just go to Africa or somewhere. And then Jordan Peterson's like, well, yeah, like go to Skid Row and you can see that it's not just a physical place in LA or whatever. Skid Row is like a hell. It's a psychological environment just as much as a physical or a environmental and kind of area in the world. It's actually also mental, like it's human created. And that struck me as very Heideggerian because it's so true. It's like, well, sure, like a atheist scientific kind of materialist would say, oh, no, it's just we're defined by environment and poverty. And then it's like, well, no, poverty can be a state of mind. It can be an environment in and of itself, if that makes sense. And the world is an amalgam of all those environments. Yes. Psychological environments, social environments, cultural environments, religious environments, and it's built into the earth, you know, the physical geography that limits where we are, right?
Yes.
So I mean, we are limited geographically, but we're not limited at all to talk to each other, to exchange ideas, and to create truth and things like that. So human beings have transcended that order of, like you said, existence from earth, nature, people. And now we've created this set of horizons where each individual is free to either overcome them and become more transcendental, which I think transcendentalism is really just getting to the ultimate horizon. That's, for me, what I would define as transcendentalism. Don't try to get into this spiritual, godlike kind of conception, because that just confuses it. I think, to use your analogy, it's basically just getting back enough to be able to see the range and scope of horizons that are in the world, and that's wisdom. It's not like scientific wisdom or like IQ.
Exactly. And it's wisdom I think, because I'm not knowing about something, right? Like,
it's time, place, where, it's when, where, who, why, you know, it's everything. It's like the
act of understanding. Here's wisdom. In the act of understanding, right?
Yeah.
The being of my being is transformed. That when I know in such a way that in the act of knowing or understanding that I am different after that understanding, now I'm enacting wisdom. right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's why, Socrates is like, he's, I think he was the first coach essentially, right? Because he would engage with people. He wasn't informing people. People didn't walk away more informed. They walked away transformed.
Yeah, he wasn't handing out textbooks.
Nope.
And that's a great example as well. I was going to bring up Aristotle, who was later than Socrates, but definitely influenced by him, said that the key form of wisdom was what everything else hangs off of, like Sophia, like wisdom in the sense, you have knowledge. But there's something more primal than that, which Heidegger talks about, and he called it phronesis. That's Aristotle's term, which is knowing how to act, when to act, why you're acting. It's the crossroads of all those kind of dimensions of knowledge that is at the basis of it. And I think if we miraculously try to bring it to this concept of like world and horizons, which I think you can, but you tell me how valid this connection is. Knowledge, when you transcend earth, nature, people, and then you start looking at the world as a set of horizons and you go further back, that's essentially phronesis in the Aristotelian sense of the more horizons you know, the more knowledge of time, timing, when to say something, when to speak the truth, when not to, when to, be seen and when not to, or why you're doing that. It's this combination that really gives people, you can't read that in a textbook. I mean, not even.
If we say a textbook to explain that like a concept, but if we say a textbook in the way that Heidegger would write, which is we're going to go down a path, and in the path, right, of essentially speaking and then noticing what gave the movement of that thought going to the background, bringing it into the foreground in a new level of a background, that when and that timing, right, is this where temporality and care, right, are, you can't separate them apart. And here's the thing I would say about temporality, and to make it, because man, by getting into time, Jesus, you're going to talk about something that's like so at the edge of it's like being, right? It's like being in time. I mean, I think you're trying to grapple that one out, right? Being in time was a grappling or trying to work that out. It was like Dostoevsky, right? It wasn't like he just basically took these core presuppositions and he wrote a novel to see what would happen. Right. And you could imagine that in writing those novels that it was a different author by the end of that novel than the one that started it. Okay? But that's a deep understanding to think about what it takes to write a novel like that, right?
And also Dostoevsky's going into the mind that when Heidegger wrote Being in Time, it was a very ambitious title. It's like not even he could finish that book. There's huge amounts of the time section that he just never got around to writing because he thought, shit, I don't even understand it, right? So if he's going, I'm in over my head, I need to.
Yeah, you realize I have to write poetry to get at this one.
Exactly. And that's so Dostoevsky, I think, already realized that, and he said, I'm going to go down this very narrow path of, crime, punishment, morality, justice, God. Or how do these intertwine in my society, like in the sense of Russian historicity and where he was in history? He said, I'm just going to go down this very narrow path, but still let appear all these things that Heidegger was worried about.
Let appear. That's a brilliant way of saying it. I'm going to let appear. That letting. It's a very different way of thinking, right?
Exactly.
And this is where we go back to that thing. What doesn't happen in the traditional sense of debating or arguing or proving a point, right? Like in a certain sense, even right now, we're in a certain sense in this conversation, we're letting appear. Like we're letting appear. That letting, right, starts to really kind of get at a way of authentic care, right? In the mode of authentic care is my understanding of what Heidegger is really talking about. Here's the thing where I started to get what temporality is a bit, or let it appear to me. It's this. Here's temporality. Okay, so you're sitting at a coffee shop. So I'm going to give two analogies, and you can kind of get the difference. So I'm sitting at a coffee shop. Let's say, I go to my favorite coffee shop, and I'm going to go and I'm going to read, and I order, a mocha or whatever, and I sit and I read or I study or whatever I do, and it's a Tuesday at 10 a.m., 10 to noon. Okay, now imagine that experience. Mm-hmm. Imagine like that a moment is happening and a particular characteristic of that moment and the mood and all that stuff. Okay. Now imagine that same Tuesday at the same time, 10 to 12, same mocha, same chair, reading the same book. Yet after I'm done, my mother's going to come in and meet me. That's a different moment. Think about that. Like if my mother in the future, right, if I know my mother's going to come and meet me in 2 hours, right? Now, if you bring yourself back to like, if my mother's not going to come meet me, there's the way that book occurs to me. There's the feel of the moment, right? There's what I notice and I don't notice. There's my heart rate. There's everything, right? And then if I know that my mother's going to come meet me, it's in this way that you can't make an object out of it and describe it. It's a different moment.
Yeah, it just kind of hit me that it's not just biases from your past that affect your future. It's your future that bias your present, in the sense that it changes time and how you exist based on what you perceive to be is coming next.
Exactly. And that's where conversation can be transformative, right? That we can engage in a conversation, and that our sense of the future and what's possible can shift, and we are then in a different moment, right? Than we started, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because you're putting yourself in control a little bit more, but also letting just the moment happen.
Yeah. And that's what, like, if you could say like what a coach does, if it's halftime at the Super Bowl and the team's down 30-0, they go in and the coach has a conversation with them. Well, what is that conversation going to do? Right. Well, it's going to, on some level, when they walk, like the game that they left through this conversation, the game that they go back out to is different. That sense of the future of what they're getting ready to do is through conversation, through dialogue, right?
And I think where Heidegger terms the event of being, capital B being, is where future, present, and past are all jammed into one like upspring of just realization. Like they could be micro tiny realizations that I've had about 20 in this conversation, or massive ones where you really just change your entire life because something happens and you're not aware of the dimensions of time in that moment because they're all the same thing. And I think the most
temporality versus time. Yes.
The most poetic kind of representation of this is just quickly the Nietzsche story, Thus Spake Zarathustra, where Zarathustra goes up the mountain carrying that dwarf on his back, and he carries the dwarf on his back until he gets to a gate, and he goes, what's this gate? Where does the path lead? And he turns to the dwarf, and the dwarf's sitting on the side of the gate off the path on a rock, and he's looking at Zarathustra and looking at the gate, and he's saying, oh, well, all time is a flat circle, or all time goes straight and it's circular in shape or something like that. He says it in a very riddle way, right? And Zarathustra goes, no, that's not right. It's everything that was and is right here. And I just have to face it. And I don't have to understand it necessarily. I just have to be in this mode of being to understand the truth of this moment and where it could lead, where the possibilities are, which Zarathustra doesn't presuppose anything, which is the power of the point of that story, where it's like he becomes basically a man of infinite possibilities. And when he turns back, the dwarf disappears. In that story, Nietzsche obviously made it up, but it's based on something that was very important to him. The idea of the moment and the eternal recurrence of the same and everything like that, the dwarf's objectifying time and saying there is future, past, present, circle, you're just going to go round and round, who cares? And he's sitting on the side, and it's like this metaphor works on so many levels because we do that all the time. We are the dwarf, whether you're a scientist or a theologian or just going day to day. It's like, well, You know, we talk in cliches about living in the moment and who knows what the future holds and all that. It's like, well, do you really know what those mean? And if you really thought about it with respect to your life, how would that change you?
Yes.
And so
yeah,
I love that.
Change is not thinking, I would say not thinking about it, but thinking it. Time, like in that moment, like it was like you were like, whoa, in that moment, I don't think you thought about time.
No.
You thought it, right? You thought time.
Yeah.
And that's transformative.
Thanks a lot, Guy, and hopefully we'll get you back on sometime because this is a topic we can talk about.
I think we just got started. This is really, 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 really fun.
And hopefully anyone listening, you know, they get something out of this, even if they're not familiar with Heidegger, because I think this conversation was broad enough to kind of get a good intro into it. So thanks a lot for your time, and have a great rest of the day.
Great. Thank you so much. So great.
Thanks, Guy.